Well, hello everyone, and I'm Elspeth Jones. I'm host of this series, and very happy to have a number of guests with me today who are going to introduce themselves in a second. We're talking today about a whole range of different things around what we like to think in international education of as diversity and inclusion, but we don't necessarily unpack that to any great extent. So I've invited some people who I think are going to be able to shed completely different lights on this in some ways. And we're focusing particularly around identities and sexuality, gender, a whole range of different aspects of what's potentially leading to stigma and discrimination. And so we're going to hear from lots of different perspectives. I'm going to ask my friends to introduce themselves now. KJ, would you like to begin?
Sure. So, hi, my name is KJ. My pronouns are they and them. I'm a queer, non-binary Malaysian Chinese PhD student studying at the Australian Catholic University.
Thank you. Maria?
Hi, everybody. I'm Maria Pallotta-Chiarolli. I'm an honorary fellow at the School of Communication and Creative Arts at Deakin Uni and a founding member with Shanton of the Australian LGBTIQA Multicultural Council in 2004, and the Globe Straight Ally Award for LGBTI work, and most recently on a very fraught day, Elspeth, Australia Day, with a very fraught, very difficult award, an Order of Australia, which I hope to put to very good use. And I thank my nominators from all my communities.
And congratulations on that, Maria. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you.
Shanton.
Hi, Elspeth, and great to be part of this series again. I'm a professor of information behaviors at the University of Melbourne in the School of Computing and Information Systems. And as Maria said, I had the honor of being one of the first co-conveners of the AGMC, the Multicultural Council for the LGBTIQA plus community here in Australia. And actually thinking back, I was just finishing my PhD at a point where I was one of the co-conveners. Maria was one of the first people who interviewed me when I was an international student as well about my lived experience. So it's come full circle. So thank you for this.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, we're focusing particularly around international education. But before we go any further, one of the aspects of this, I think, which we need to think about is intersectionality, and we'll be talking about that. So, Maria, can you just give us what you understand by intersectionality?
Sure. I'll try to keep it very brief. It's very sometimes complex, but I do want to honour the person who created the theory and really brought the theory forward, a Black feminist, African-American, Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989 began to talk about intersectionality, followed by Patricia Hill Collins, another very strong African-American feminist. And what it means, there's two parts to it, and often people tend to focus on one and not the other. Intersectionality is the way that various factors of ourselves, various parts of our lives and identities overlap and interweave. So, for example, in my case, I'm heterosexual, I'm from an Italian working class background, I'm cisgendered, and so they're just some of the factors, and I have very great education. You know, I've been privileged with that. So we look at the overlapping of marginalities or the overlapping of identities. Now, the other side to that too is the overlappings of power and privilege. So some of us may be marginal in some settings, but we may have power or privilege in other settings. So it's about how racism, classism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia interweave, but also what power and privilege do we have in different settings that we can put to good use.
Yeah, that's a great, concise explanation, and I'm sure some people will find that really helpful. So we're talking about intersectionality in the sense that you said also, Maria, in this fantastic report, which I'll link to at the bottom of the video, you talked about that we are all multiple selves. So we've all got intersectionalities in the way that you've just described. So when navigating identities all the time. But in particular, today we want to think about international education. So what are some of the issues facing international students in relation to identities, sexualities, intersectionality, and how explaining really how what can we do really to think about this more deeply. Those of us who are involved in international education, what should we be thinking about, and how can we actually make a difference to ourselves as much as to our students, probably. So can we start with that, Shanton?
Sure. Wow, that's a huge question, Elspeth. And I think if we think about the diversity of students that we have, I think that in research in international students and international education, sometimes we treat international students as a group. We call them international students, when in fact, there is so much complex diversity. And when we talk about issues around gender, identity, and sexuality, it gets even more fraught in the sense that, you know, the way that people experience identity, sexualities is very culture bound in some ways. And they bring with them all those culture-bound values and identification, and it doesn't change just because they get on a plane to come to another country, right? So, so we're seeing layers upon layers of complexity. So depending on where you come from, gender and sexuality might be something that you're discovering for the first time, that you feel that you are able to talk about it because you're in an environment. Or you might be going from, you know, for an exchange student, for example, going from a place when you're out and proud, going to a country where it's illegal, where you almost have to go back into the closet. And so you've got this complexity in international education where we really have to recognize that the lived experience of students is so diverse, depending on who they are and what their experience is. And, you know, I know that Maria wrote a very interesting paper and report way back in the 90s, titled something like "International Students Too Busy Studying to Have Sex."
Yes, yes.
Right? But when in fact, we know that they do, and they're very busy young people in the classroom and outside, may I say. And so there are all these identities coming to the fore and playing out, even as they are working through transition to university or colleges in a new country.
And it may be, for example, because, well, from the outside, I think we think of Australia as being certainly the cities, the Australian cities being very diverse, very multicultural. And it may be that international students have been attracted for those reasons. And I suppose that in some cases they may be disappointed, or they may have different experiences. So maybe KJ, could we come to you around this, around lived experience, and, you know, how it, in a way, how coming to Australia has been for you, and whether you recognize what the sorts of things Shanton's been saying?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I think especially coming from Malaysia, where like being gay or being any sort of like identity within sexuality or gender beyond the binary or the heterosexual kind of like normative society is illegal. So in that sense, it's like coming to Australia, I had kind of like a conflict between my identities, where my first instinct is, oh my gosh, finally I'm in, like exactly like Shanton says, like, oh my gosh, finally I'm in Australia. I can kind of almost like experiment with what I thought I was, because I was never allowed to come out. I was never allowed to experiment with my sexuality or gender. So to me, coming to Australia was like, oh yes, finally I get to actually try. But I think that was kind of also compounded with what both Maria and like Shanton was saying, which was, I'm also trying to adjust to the Australian culture. So I was like, it's in an unfamiliar country. I'm trying to figure out the subtleties of like the slang, the Aussie slang. And it was interesting because I kind of ended up getting two types of experiences, which I think is interesting. My first year that I was in Australia, I actually was with mainly like Asian students. So students who either came from Singapore or from Malaysia or from South Asia, so from India. So I kind of was cocooned in my own like culture, which kind of made it a little bit hard to experiment with at the start. But as I start to like gain friends who were like born and raised in Australia, where they were a little bit more out, I felt like in my second, third year, I could actually kind of express myself a little bit better. But even then, I think even within our goal of like, kind of almost like sexual racism. So it's like, there's like within the community, being Asian might not actually be a good thing. Like they might kind of like, and especially in the early 2000s, there was like discrimination towards Asian people in the queer community. So it's quite an interesting kind of like context to kind of feel through that. But yeah, but as a student, it was interesting to kind of like see really proud Australian students and me myself trying to figure out how far would I kind of like come out, to say the least. Yeah, interesting. So in terms of these various forms of potential stigma and discrimination that we've described as intersectionality in a way, do you think, have we reached the point where we're more accepting, or as a society we're more accepting of some types of diversity than others, do you think? Anybody? Is there more, for example, covert discrimination than overt, or do you think?
I think that's really interesting, because I think, you know, one of the challenges for queer international students seeking to be part of the queer community in even a liberal city like Melbourne or Sydney or London, for example, KJ mentioned the idea of sexual racism, where there's a hierarchy of cultures within the queer community, of, you know, what cultures are desirable and which cultures are not. And it is a fetishization as well of particular cultures and skin colors and all that sort of stuff that are just fraught. And you throw in an 18-year-old trying to navigate all of this within the community, that they think, oh, you know, liberal cities, so it must be okay. And then you come out into that community and you find that you're constantly rejected, and there's quite racist comments on dating apps. Elspeth, you'd be surprised, you know, people do say things like no rice, no curry, for example, on dating apps that are quite, it is very hurtful for the young person, you know. For an old person like me, it doesn't matter. I've heard it so much. You've built a thick skin, you know, it's kind of like, okay, what else can you discriminate against me? But for a young person, that stigma, it doesn't build confidence, and that means that the person is not quite at home within the home culture, where they cannot be authentically themselves. Neither can they be fully accepted in the liberal culture from that point of view, and that therein lies the challenge.
Well, it's almost as though you're saying that we may be overcoming certain types of discrimination, but we're just replacing it with different types of discrimination. Is what we're saying. And so, I mean, it's kind of very depressing, but in order to unpack this further, then what can be done about it? And I was very interested in the report that Maria and colleagues wrote, the idea of unconscious and unintentional bias, which we may think we're doing very well, for example, in recognizing this or understanding that and speaking in a certain way, but probably we're not. And then linked to that was the concept of allyship. And I know, Maria, you've won an award for being the best ally possible to the multicultural, multi-faith, LGBTIQA plus community, I think is what, it's along those lines. But so what do we mean by allyship?
Yeah, and I did accept that award, Elspeth, and thank you, everyone. I accepted that award in the hope that one day we won't need that award at all. I think just if I could just go back one step, there was one thing I didn't, which is about what Shanton was saying about, you know, which self are you going to be, is about the settings. In intersectionality, we've got to be very careful, which comes into the unconscious bias stuff, Elspeth. It's not just about the individual and their marginalities and privileges, but it's about the different settings that we all go in and out of. So, for example, if I'm working with some queer Muslim international students, if they don't out their sexuality or non-binary gender, then they'll be fine in a mosque, or they'll be fine at a Muslim event in Melbourne. But if they out themselves, they may not be. In a queer community, if, you know, there would be parts of themselves, queerness may be acceptable, but as Shanton said, in that setting, there's some incredibly racist and Islamophobic comments that are made. So So I just wanted to clarify, it's about systems and settings, and that the individual has to navigate those. And Judy and Buddy and I were and my amazing co-researchers and colleagues were very clear. We've got to keep putting the focus back on systems and settings and hierarchies that we are all trying to navigate, because those unconscious biases and unintentional biases are happening in places where systems aren't addressing them. So as a segue into allyship, it is quite a fraught thing, because allyship is not self-identified, it's not self-determined, and so that would be step one. To be an ally is you are recognized or identified as an ally by someone else. It doesn't mean you're perfect, far from it. It doesn't mean that you know what you're, necessarily what you're doing, but there are certain things that are important. And that is, firstly, there's a difference between being a passive ally. And this is where it can get very uncomfortable. A passive ally is someone who does the reading, puts up the symbols, but may not necessarily stand up, take risks, and take action. So we're now identifying passive allies who mean well, but it's about what action, what do you actually do? And there's another word that's coming out now called co-conspirators. Are you prepared to stand with and work with? Are you prepared to take some of the risks that come with it? Because if you're an ally, then you're actually privileged. You can wear some of that. The other side to that, though, is that you have to be prepared to know when to step back. Or if someone says to you with lived experience, I got this, can you just go and sit over there? You will quite happily go and sit over there and be quiet. So it's about listening and learning. And sometimes we are going to stuff up, but we have to listen to that, and we have to sit with the discomfort. We're not going to get into straight fragility. We're not going to get into white fragility. We're not going to center ourselves and go, oh, but I meant, nah. Yeah. We will just sit back and go, I'm sorry. I've acknowledged where I made a mistake. I apologize. What can I do? I don't say, so I tend to say, how can I be of use? If you invite me in, I will be there. But I will also want to be told when I need to go away or sit at the back or be quiet, even though I'm not being very quiet right now, but that's well, a good ally has to listen.
That's that section in the report around allyship, and you said that it can be either appropriate and useful or inappropriate and detrimental. And I mean that was really powerful reading, I thought, and very I really hope people will follow up and have a look at the report, because I found it very uncomfortable. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, is this me? Am I doing the right thing? And I asking questions. It's very, very, you have to question yourself as to how you're dealing with some of these things. But sorry.
Absolutely. I'm not an international student, and I'm not an LGBTIQ plus international student. Therefore, an ally's job is to listen and also to push forward, mentor, and provide opportunities for people with lived experience where it's safe and comfortable. And in order for you to then to step back and Elspeth, I love it, to sit with discomfort. That goes with it. If we're not ready to be uncomfortable and to be pointed out, then we should just get out of the way.
So bringing it back to international education then, as we sort of move towards the end of this session, what can be done in terms of international education, perhaps generally, or international educators, and how can they better support their students? And I think, Shanton, you mentioned also that this can have an impact on pedagogy as well, the way we work in the classroom with students. You've already said we shouldn't kind of lump international students together, and it's not the case that all Chinese students are like this, or indeed all gay students think this way, or whatever. So what does an international educator do?
That's fantastic, because one of the key things, and Maria earlier talked about systems, and what is the college or the university but a big, huge, unfathomable system for a student, right? And one of the key things here is that as academics, as guides, as mentors within universities, who are interested in international education to recognize that diversity of international students plays right across this as well, that being a queer identifying international student doesn't put them into a category. For example, there's a piece of work here in Australia that's looking at the increase in HIV positive conversion amongst Asian men, right? And part of that is international students. And the assumption immediately goes into this idea that Chinese students and Asian men tend to have less sexual health education, when in fact, there's been rich research that shows that even within that community, there's a wide range of sexual health literacy, from people who are fully literate to people who have no clue, all coming from the same country. So from an international education perspective, it's this idea of finding out and listening to the stories from the students, and to actually recognize that diversity, and to act accordingly, and to support accordingly. And the other dangerous thing that I have seen before is this idea that we don't take Western norms of queer behavior and impose that on international queer students. So the idea, and I'm going to throw to KJ in a second, because he is the student talking about this, not me. But think about how do you work with students who might be coming out, or is there a better way of inviting in? And really, each student is a bit different from that point of view.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, and I think probably we're all in a context where the university's almost certainly got policies around anti-discrimination practice, for example, but it's actually the lived experience that's the key to it all, isn't it? So, KJ, what can be done?
I think like what Shanton was saying is actually quite interesting, because as someone who's applied to unis multiple times as an international student, it's weird. I almost think like, even like from a systemic perspective, I completely agree. It needs to be rethought. And even to the point where I think even the forms that we fill in have to be rethought. Just, I mean, like two examples is that when we fill in a form, like for example, when I tried to fill in a form once, they only gave me male, female, or other, or intersex. And I was just like, but I don't fit any of those genders. Like, what do I check? But I was lucky enough that my supervisor was contacted the head of department, and they actually kind of like said, all right, you don't need to fill in the gender, we'll fix this. What are some of the ideas? And so I think even the basics of a form helps the student to kind of figure out, and also kind of, it's almost like leading. And I think it's what Shanton was saying, like inviting. It's the student, the way that the student checks off which boxes in that form invites you to then kind of look at it and go, okay, so the student identifies as. But another thing to think about is, I think once that's kind of gone through, they might be okay checking that off on the form, but they might not be okay with you talking about it in a tutorial or in a lecture. So I suppose the one way kind of like, as a tertiary educator, it's like can actually think about like international students, especially when they're coming out in the context of either sexuality or gender, is I think constant like touching base. It's a kind of almost like a, hey, you know, even creating, I think as Maria put it, like creating a safe space and saying like, it's like, you know, there's no discrimination in here, you know, everyone of every sexuality and gender is accepted. We do not accept any kind of, and I think you can even pull out the anti-discrimination policies and say, we do not discriminate. And that kind of like, once you set that space, I think students can either choose to, you've also given them the option to either come out to you and this class and the university, or they've invited you kind of in and say, hey, I'm happy for you to know that I'm non-binary, but can you use these pronouns when we're in tutorials? So then there's like a shared kind of understanding between the lecturer or the tutor with that student who may or may not want to come out at that point.
And I think you made an important point there, which made me think that, you know, sometimes we kind of expect our students to speak for a community, you know, or speak for a nation of students, and we need to keep thinking of people as individuals and try and work the best way we can across that, and just do our best. And sometimes we will make mistakes, as Maria said, but it's been a really fascinating conversation, guys. Thank you so much. And it's really good of you to take this time and good to see you on the other side of the world looking sunny and warm.
I think it's such an important conversation, Elspeth, and I think, you know, we are all constantly learning. One of the things that I learned most recently was actually at last year's Wear It Purple Day, where I was invited to speak at a panel about LGBTIQA plus within engineering and IT and employability and all that sort of stuff. And until that point in time, when I was, and we've been on Zoom for like a year and a half by that time, right? I never put my pronouns next to my name. I always have my name and that's it. And because as a person myself, I have never felt the need to put my pronoun until it was pointed out to me by a co-panelist that putting your pronoun is not about you. It's about you creating a safe space for other people to know that you're aware of this and that you are open for conversation. That was the first time. Ever since then, I've got my pronouns, not for me, but to create a safe space. Always learning. Always
learning. Yeah, we are. And we should be, especially in the field of education. And I've learned a lot from speaking to you all. It's been fantastic. And thank you so much for all you're doing, and hope to keep in touch with you all. Thanks again.
Thank you, Elspeth.